Jacob Williams trudged through the humid streets of New Orleans' Treme neighborhood, the air thick with the scent of magnolias and the faint, earthy dampness of the Mississippi River. The evening sky, streaked with hues of orange and purple, cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. At 32, the sergeant carried the weight of 3 years in Afghanistan, his final months spent in the relentless chaos of combat zones. His chest bore medals for bravery, pinned to his uniform during a ceremony he barely remembered. But his face told a different story. Lines etched deep from exhaustion, eyes shadowed by the ghosts of what he had seen and done. In his unit, they called him a hero, the man who dragged 2 wounded comrades from a hail of gunfire. But Jacob felt no pride in the title. It was a hollow word, one that failed to bridge the chasm between who he had been and who he had become. All he wanted now was home, the familiar embrace of his wife, Sarah, and the crooked grin of his younger brother, Lucas, whom he had not seen since leaving for war. Jacob had chosen not to announce his return, savoring the thought of surprising those he loved most. In his mind, he pictured Sarah, his high school sweetheart, her eyes lighting up as she rushed into his arms, her laughter filling the quiet spaces of their home. He imagined Lucas, always the optimist despite his circumstances, flashing that infectious smile that could lift Jacob's spirits no matter the weight on his shoulders. 5 years earlier, a car accident had left Lucas confined to a wheelchair, a tragedy that had shaken their family to its core. Before deploying, Jacob had knelt beside his brother, gripping his hand, and asked Sarah to look after him. He trusted her implicitly, just as he trusted Lucas, who had always been more than a sibling, a confidant, a mirror of his own hopes and fears. The thought of their reunion kept Jacob grounded as he navigated the familiar streets, his worn rucksack slung over one shoulder, its canvas frayed from years of use. The Treme neighborhood unfolded around him, a tapestry of history and resilience. Shotgun houses lined the streets, their faded colors softened by time, while the distant hum of jazz drifted from a nearby bar. Children played on a corner, their laughter mingling with the clatter of a passing streetcar. Jacob passed a corner store where he and Lucas used to buy sodas as kids, the memory so vivid he could almost taste the cold fizz on his tongue. The weight of his service, the memories of sand and blood, seemed to fade with each step closer to home. He had written letters to Sarah from dusty outposts, promising her a future where they could leave the struggles of the past behind. To Lucas, he sent stories of the stars over the desert, knowing his brother would find wonder in the smallest details. Those letters, now tucked in his rucksack, were his tether to this place, this life he longed to reclaim. The house came into view, a modest 2-story cottage on the edge of Treme, its blue paint peeling in strips, exposing the weathered wood beneath. The front porch sagged slightly, adorned with a pair of creaking swings that swayed in the evening breeze. An ancient oak stood sentinel by the driveway, its gnarled branches stretching over the roof like protective arms. To Jacob, it was more than a house. It was the anchor of his world, the place where he had proposed to Sarah under that very oak, where he and Lucas had carved their initials into the porch railing as teenagers. He paused at the gate, his hand resting on the rusted latch, and took a deep breath. The air carried the faint sweetness of jasmine from a neighbor's garden, grounding him in the moment. His heart quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation, the kind that made his fingers tremble as he reached for the key in his pocket. Jacob's boots scuffed against the gravel path as he approached the front door, each step a reclamation of the life he had left behind. He had survived ambushes, IEDs, and nights when sleep came only in fragments, all for this moment, to walk through that door and feel whole again. The key turned smoothly in the lock, a small victory after years of uncertainty. He pushed the door open, expecting the familiar creak of hinges, the scent of Sarah's cooking, or perhaps the soft hum of Lucas's favorite blues records. The house was quiet, but not empty. A faint glow spilled from the hallway, casting a warm light across the worn hardwood floor. Jacob set his rucksack down, careful not to disturb the stillness, and allowed himself a fleeting smile. He was home, and soon everything would be as it should. His mind wandered to the last time he had stood in this doorway. 3 years ago, when Sarah had clung to him, her tears soaking his uniform as he promised to come back. Lucas had wheeled himself to the porch, his jaw set but his eyes betraying the fear he would not voice. Jacob had carried their faces with him through every patrol, every firefight, their memory a shield against despair. Now as he stepped inside, he felt the weight of those promises, the hope that had sustained him. The living room was unchanged, same faded couch, same framed photo of their wedding day on the mantel, Sarah's smile radiant beside his own. He moved toward the hallway, drawn to the light, his boots silent on the floor. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to embrace it, unaware that the life he had dreamed of was already slipping through his fingers. Jacob pushed the door open with a gentle nudge, the familiar creak of the hinges swallowed by the stillness of the house. His key, still warm from his pocket, had turned effortlessly in the lock, a small reassurance that some things remained unchanged. He stepped into the foyer, expecting the sound of Sarah's laughter to greet him, or perhaps the faint squeak of Lucas's wheelchair rolling across the hardwood floor. Instead, a hush enveloped the space, broken only by muffled noises drifting from the hallway. The sounds came from the bedroom on the first floor, the room where he and Sarah had shared countless nights before his deployment, whispering dreams of a future unmarred by distance or war. His pulse quickened, a faint unease stirring in his chest, but he dismissed it as the residue of exhaustion, the paranoia that clung to him after years of scanning for threats in every shadow. He moved forward, his boots silent on the worn floorboards, drawn toward the soft glow spilling from the partially open bedroom door. As he approached, the noises grew clearer, soft murmurs, the rustle of fabric, a rhythm that felt both familiar and alien. Jacob's hand tightened around the strap of his rucksack, the weight of it grounding him as his mind raced to make sense of what he heard. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of his tired senses, but his body betrayed him, each step heavier than the last. The door stood ajar, a sliver of lamplight cutting through the dim hallway. He paused, his breath shallow, and peered through the gap. The sight that met his eyes shattered the world he had carried in his heart for 3 years. Sarah, his wife, sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around Lucas, his younger brother. Their clothes lay scattered across the floor, a careless heap of fabric that spoke of intimacy. Sarah's face, illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp, held a tenderness Jacob had not seen in years, her lips moving as she whispered something to Lucas. Lucas, despite the limitations of his wheelchair-bound life, looked alive in a way Jacob could scarcely recall, his expression one of quiet joy, his hands resting on Sarah's waist with a familiarity that cut deeper than any blade. Jacob froze, the air in his lungs turning to lead, his vision narrowed, the edges blurring as the scene before him burned itself into his mind. Sarah, the woman he had loved since they were teenagers, who had promised to wait for him through the long nights of war, was entwined with his brother. Lucas, the sibling he had protected, the one he had entrusted to Sarah's care, had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. The weight of their deception pressed against his chest, a physical ache that threatened to buckle his knees. His fingers dug into the rucksack, the coarse canvas biting into his palm, and he felt the hard outline of the pistol nestled within. It was a trophy from Afghanistan, a relic of a mission gone wrong, kept not for pride but as a reminder of the cost of survival. He had never intended to use it again, but in that moment it called to him, a cold promise of clarity in the chaos of his unraveling world. Rage surged through him, a tidal wave that drowned out reason. The memories that had sustained him, Sarah's letters, Lucas's teasing grins, turned to ash in his mind. He saw only the betrayal, the violation of the trust he had placed in the two people he held closest. His hand moved of its own accord, unzipping the rucksack and closing around the pistol's grip. The metal was cool against his skin, its weight familiar from countless hours of training. He did not think of the medals pinned to his uniform, the lives he had saved, or the man he had been before the war. He saw only the figures on the bed, their closeness a mockery of everything he had fought for. With a shove, he forced the door open, the wood banging against the wall as he stepped into the room. The pistol rose in his hand, steady despite the tremor in his soul. The first shot rang out, a deafening crack that seemed to split the air. Sarah's body jerked, a red stain blooming across her chest as she slumped against the headboard. The second shot followed, catching her in the shoulder, her form collapsing fully onto the mattress. Lucas turned, his eyes wide with shock, but before he could react, a third shot tore through his chest. He fell back, his wheelchair tipping slightly as his body went limp. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that swallowed the echoes of the gunfire. Jacob stood motionless, the pistol still raised, its barrel warm in his grip. Blood pooled on the sheets, stark against the pale fabric, and the room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in as the reality of his actions took hold. Sarah's face, frozen in a final expression of surprise, stared blankly at the ceiling. Lucas's head lolled to one side, his once vibrant eyes dull and unseeing. Jacob's breath came in shallow gasps, the pistol slipping from his fingers to clatter onto the floor. He stared at the scene, his mind struggling to reconcile the violence with the love he had felt for these two people. The rucksack hung loosely from his shoulder, a tether to the life he had walked into only moments ago. He had returned a hero, a man who had faced death and emerged whole, but now he stood as something else, something broken, something irredeemable. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, a suffocating force that threatened to crush what remained of his spirit. He backed away, his boots catching on the edge of a discarded shirt, and turned toward the door. The house, once a sanctuary, felt like a tomb, its walls echoing with the finality of his choice. He stumbled into the hallway, the glow of the bedroom fading behind him, and fled into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of everything he had once called home. Jacob's feet pounded against the uneven pavement, carrying him blindly through the darkened streets of New Orleans. The city's pulse, jazz spilling from dimly lit bars, the clink of glasses, the murmur of late-night crowds, faded into a distant hum, drowned out by the deafening roar of his own heartbeat. He had no memory of fleeing the house, only the sensation of movement, his body propelled by an instinct older than thought. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and the faint tang of Creole spices from a nearby restaurant, but Jacob registered none of it. His mind was a fractured mosaic, replaying the moment he had pulled the trigger, the crimson stains spreading across the bed, the lifeless gazes of Sarah and Lucas. He stumbled past a row of shotgun houses, their porch lights casting pools of yellow that he avoided like traps. His hands trembled as he shoved the pistol, still warm from use, into a storm drain, its metal glinting briefly before vanishing into the murk. The rucksack followed, stuffed into a dumpster in a narrow alley, its contents a tether to a life he could no longer claim. His military uniform, stiff with the dust of Afghanistan, clung to his skin, the only remnant of the man he had been hours ago. He moved without direction, guided by the muscle memory of a soldier trained to survive. Every shadow seemed to pulse with threat, every passing car a potential pursuer. He knew the police would soon descend on the house, alerted by neighbors startled awake by the gunshots. The bodies of Sarah and Lucas would be found, their blood staining the sheets, and the investigation would begin. His name, once celebrated as a hero's, would be whispered in horror, plastered across newspapers and television screens. He could almost see the headlines. War veteran turned murderer, a man undone by the very home he had fought to return to. Yet even as these thoughts churned, his body pressed forward, weaving through the labyrinth of Tremay's back streets. His destination emerged from the fog of his panic, an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts, a relic from his youth. He and Lucas had once used it as a hideout, sneaking away from the world to share dreams and dodge troubles. The thought of Lucas pierced him, a fresh wound, but he shoved it aside, focusing on the need to disappear. The warehouse loomed ahead, its corrugated metal walls rusted and sagging under the weight of neglect. Jacob slipped through a broken gate, the chain-link fence rattling softly behind him. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and old oil. Moonlight filtered through cracked skylights, illuminating piles of discarded crates and tangles of cobwebs that swayed in the draft. He navigated the maze of rusted shipping containers, his boots crunching on shards of broken glass. In a shadowed corner, he sank to the floor, his back against a cold metal wall. His chest heaved, each breath a struggle against the weight of what he had done. Images flashed unbidden. Sarah's smile at their prom, her lips soft against his. Lucas teaching him to shoot hoops in their backyard, his laughter echoing despite his younger age. These memories clashed violently with the scene in the bedroom, the intimacy he had witnessed, the betrayal that had unraveled everything. He searched for justification, for some logic to explain their actions, but found only a hollow ache. He could not absolve them, nor could he forgive himself. The reality of his situation settled over him like a shroud. The police would be methodical, led by someone like Detective Marcus Reed, a grizzled veteran of the New Orleans force whose name Jacob vaguely recalled from local news. Reed had already been called to the crime scene, stepping into the house as neighbors huddled outside, their faces pale with shock. The detective's sharp eyes had scanned the bedroom, noting the blood, the overturned wheelchair, the absence of forced entry. His attention had snagged on a small object glinting on the floor, an army dog tag engraved with Jacob's name, dropped in the chaos of his flight. It was a careless mistake, one that gave the investigation a clear path. Reed had pocketed the tag, his jaw tightening as he recognized the name of a decorated soldier. The discovery fueled his resolve, but Jacob was already beyond reach, swallowed by the city's underbelly. Jacob's training kicked in, overriding the chaos in his mind. He assessed his situation with the detached precision of a man who had faced death in foreign deserts. His uniform was a liability, its camouflage pattern too distinctive in a city where eyes were always watching. He stripped off the jacket, bundling it into a corner beneath a pile of rotting cardboard. His undershirt, damp with sweat, offered little protection against the night's chill, but he welcomed the discomfort. It kept him alert. He needed to move, to find shelter, food, and a way to blend into the city's rhythm. The warehouse was a temporary refuge, but he could not stay long. Dawn was hours away, and with it would come the full weight of the manhunt. He thought of the skills that had kept him alive overseas, how to navigate without a map, how to evade capture, how to become invisible. Those lessons, honed in the crucible of war, were his only advantage now. His fingers brushed the dog tags still hanging around his neck, a reflex from years of wearing them. He yanked them off, the chains snapping with a faint ping, and hurled them into the darkness. The act felt final, a severance from the soldier he had been. Yet the weight of his actions remained, a burden no amount of running could shed. He leaned his head back, staring at the rusted beams overhead, and tried to piece together a plan. The city was vast, its corners filled with places to hide, abandoned buildings, crowded markets, the transient flow of tourists in the French Quarter. But New Orleans was also a city that remembered its own. In Jacob's face, once a source of pride, was now a liability. He closed his eyes, willing his mind to quiet, but the images returned. Sarah's body crumpling, Lucas's shocked stare, the blood that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He had destroyed the two people who had anchored him, and in doing so, had obliterated the man he thought he was. The warehouse's silence offered no answers, only a fleeting respite before the world closed in. Jacob's existence had dwindled to a series of calculated movements, each step a fragile thread holding him above the abyss of capture. 7 days had passed since the night he fled the house, leaving behind the bloodied wreckage of his life. New Orleans, once a haven, had become a labyrinth of peril, its vibrant streets now a hunting ground. He survived on scraps, pilfering food from market stalls and earning a few dollars through odd jobs, carrying crates in back alleys or sweeping floors for cash, always under the radar. His military uniform, a relic of pride, had been traded for a tattered jacket and jeans stolen from a laundromat, their faded fabric cloaking him in anonymity. He avoided the city's bustling heart, steering clear of Bourbon Street's neon glow and the crowded markets where eyes might linger too long. He slept in the husks of abandoned buildings, their crumbling walls offering temporary shelter from the relentless pursuit he knew was closing in. The city hummed with rumors, whispered in bars and printed in bold headlines. The war hero turned murderer, a tale that captivated and horrified. Jacob's face, once celebrated in local papers for his bravery, now adorned wanted posters tacked to telephone poles and flashed across television screens in diner windows. Detective Marcus Reed, a weathered figure in the New Orleans police force, had taken the case personally. His office overflowed with files on Jacob, military records, commendations, detailed reports of missions in Afghanistan where he had defied death. Reed saw not just a fugitive, but a man fractured by war and betrayal, a dangerous combination that made him unpredictable. The detective's nights were spent poring over maps and witness statements, piecing together Jacob's movements. The dog tag found in the bedroom had been the first clue, but Reed had since uncovered traces of Jacob's presence. A stolen jacket reported missing, a blurry figure caught on a convenience store camera, a vendor's vague description of a quiet man paying for bread with trembling hands. Reed knew Jacob's training made him a ghost, capable of vanishing into the city's seams, but he also knew no one could run forever. The detective's resolve hardened with each passing day, driven by a need to restore order to a city shaken by the crime. Jacob, meanwhile, felt the walls of his world contracting. Doubt gnawed at him, eroding the certainty that had fueled his escape. His nights were haunted by dreams that blurred the lines between memory and madness. In them, Sarah and Lucas appeared not as the broken figures he had left behind, but as they had been. Alive, laughing, their voices calling him back to a home that no longer existed. These visions intertwined with nightmares of war, where he crouched in burning villages, bullets tearing through the air, his hands failing to save those he loved. The faces of his fallen comrades morphed into Sarah's, then Lucas's, their eyes accusing him of abandoning them. He woke gasping, his body slick with sweat, questioning whether his mind was unraveling under the strain. Yet surrender was unthinkable. The thought of a cell, of facing the world's judgment as a killer, was a weight he could not bear. He pressed on, driven by the primal urge to survive, even as the city tightened its grip around him. On the seventh evening, hunger drove him to a small market in the Bywater district, its stalls crowded with late shoppers. He kept his head low, his stolen jacket's hood pulled tight, and handed a crumpled bill to a vendor for a loaf of bread. The man's gaze lingered, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, though Jacob was gone before suspicion could solidify. He moved quickly, weaving through the crowd, but unease clung to him like damp air. An hour later, as he slipped through a quiet street, he caught the flash of a patrol car's lights in his peripheral vision. His heart lurched, and he broke into a run, his boots slapping against the cobblestones of the French Quarter's narrow alleys. The city's charm, its wrought iron balconies, its street musicians, became obstacles in his flight. He ducked behind a dumpster, then darted across a courtyard, the sound of radios crackling in the distance. His lungs burned, but his training kept his movements precise, each turn a calculated bid for freedom. His flight led him to a place he had not planned to revisit, a small, weathered church tucked between two larger buildings, its steeple a faint silhouette against the night sky. As a child, he had come here with his family, kneeling in the pews, the scent of incense grounding him in moments of uncertainty. Now it was a refuge of last resort. He slipped through a side door left unlocked, the hinges groaning softly as he entered. The interior was dim, lit only by the flicker of votive candles near the altar. The air carried the faint must of old wood and wax, a stillness that seemed to pause the chaos outside. Jacob sank into a pew, his breath ragged, and let the silence envelop him. For the first time since that night, he considered stopping, facing the consequences, letting the world see the man he had become. But the shame of it, the thought of his name forever tied to murder, anchored him to his resolve. He was a soldier, not a coward, and he would not be taken easily. The moment of reflection was shattered by the creak of the church's main doors. Moonlight spilled across the floor, revealing the silhouettes of three figures. Detective Reed stepped forward, his trench coat catching the candlelight, flanked by two uniformed officers whose hands rested on their holsters. Jacob's body tensed, his eyes scanning the shadows for an escape. The church, with its single exit and high windows, offered no easy way out. Reed's presence was deliberate, his posture calm but unyielding, a hunter who had tracked his quarry to the end. Jacob's hand brushed the knife tucked into his belt, a crude weapon scavenged from an abandoned warehouse. He had no desire to kill again, but the instinct to survive surged within him, a fire that refused to be extinguished. The officers fanned out, their footsteps echoing in the vaulted space, while Reed remained at the center, his gaze fixed on the pews. Jacob crouched lower, his heart pounding, every muscle coiled for what would come next. The hunt had reached its peak, and he was cornered, a man with nowhere left to run. The beams of the police flashlights cut through the darkened nave, casting stark shadows across the church's worn stone floor. Jacob crouched behind the altar, his fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of a rusty knife he had scavenged from the warehouse days earlier. The blade, dull and chipped, was a poor weapon, but it was all he had. His pulse thundered in his ears, each beat a reminder of the corner he had been driven into. He had no desire to spill more blood, yet the thought of surrender, of facing a world that would brand him a monster, felt like a death in itself. Detective Reed stood at the center of the aisle, his silhouette framed by the flickering candlelight, his hands raised to show he carried no weapon. The two officers flanking him moved cautiously, their boots scuffing softly as they scanned the pews. But Reed's presence dominated the space, his eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked onto the shadows where Jacob hid. The detective's calm demeanor belied the intensity of the hunt, a predator who had tracked his prey to its final stand. Jacob's grip on the knife tightened, his knuckles whitening as he weighed his options. The church offered no escape. Its single exit was blocked, and the high stained glass windows were too narrow to climb. His body ached from days of running, his muscles stiff from cold nights spent on concrete floors. Yet the fire of survival still burned within him, honed by years of facing death in distant deserts. He could rush the officers, use the knife to create chaos, slip past them into the night. But the thought dissolved as Reed took a step forward, his movements deliberate, his hands still raised. The detective's voice had been steady, cutting through the silence with words that pierced deeper than Jacob had expected. Reed spoke of Jacob's service, the medals earned in Afghanistan, the weight of war that reshaped a man's soul. He mentioned Sarah and Lucas, not as victims of Jacob's rage, but as people who had been his anchor, loved and lost in a moment of shattering betrayal. The words struck a chord, stirring something buried beneath the anger that had driven Jacob for a week. The knife felt heavier in his hand, its purpose less certain. Reed continued to advance, his steps measured, closing the distance between them. The officers held their positions, their flashlights sweeping the corners, but Jacob's focus remained on the detective. Reed's voice had carried details that gnawed at Jacob's resolve. Letters found in the house, written by Sarah to Lucas in the lonely months of Jacob's absence. In them, she had poured out her fears, her longing for her husband, her dread that he might not return. Lucas, confined to his wheelchair, had offered her comfort, a shared solace that had spiraled into a mistake born of desperation. The intimacy Jacob had witnessed was not a calculated betrayal, but a fleeting lapse, a human error in the face of isolation. The truth sliced through him, sharper than any lie he had told himself. He wanted to reject it, to cling to the righteous fury that had justified his actions. But the images of Sarah's lifeless body and Lucas's shocked gaze flooded his mind. His hands trembled, the knife wavering as the weight of his guilt pressed down, a force he could no longer outrun. The altar's cold stone pressed against Jacob's back, grounding him in the moment. Reed was closer now, near enough that Jacob could see the lines etched into his face, the weariness of a man who had seen too many tragedies. The detective's words had stopped, replaced by a silence that demanded a response. Jacob's breath hitched, his chest tight with a hollow ache that had replaced the fire of defiance. The knife slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floor with a sound that echoed in the vaulted space. He sank to his knees, the impact jarring his bones, but he felt no pain, only an overwhelming emptiness. The fight had drained from him, leaving behind a man stripped of purpose. Reed approached, his movements slow, almost reverent, as if recognizing the surrender not just of a fugitive, but of a soul. The detective knelt, retrieving the knife before producing a pair of handcuffs from his coat. The metal clicked around Jacob's wrists, cold and unyielding, but Jacob offered no resistance. Reed's eyes met his, and in them, Jacob saw not triumph, but a quiet understanding, a shared recognition of the cost of human frailty. The officers closed in, their flashlights lowering as they guided Jacob to his feet. He moved mechanically, his body complying, while his mind drifted elsewhere. They led him through the church's heavy doors, the night air sharp against his skin as they emerged onto the street. The patrol car waited, its lights pulsing red and blue, a beacon in the darkness. Jacob slid into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a finality that resonated in his bones. As the car pulled away, he stared through the window, the city's lights blurring into streaks of color. The French Quarter's lively chaos, the river's distant shimmer, the silhouettes of oak trees, all of it felt like a world he no longer belonged to. His thoughts lingered on Sarah's letters, on the loneliness she had endured, on Lucas's attempts to fill the void Jacob had left behind. The truth did not absolve him, but it shifted the weight of his guilt, spreading it across the years of absence and the scars of war. The car wound through the city, passing bars where jazz spilled into the night, homes where families slept unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. Jacob's gaze remained fixed on the window, the glass cool against his forehead. He wondered if this was his final glimpse of freedom, the last time he would see New Orleans as a man unbound. The handcuffs bit into his wrists, a reminder of the path he had chosen in a single, irreversible moment. Yet beneath the shame, a strange calm settled over him. The chase was over, the hunt concluded, and with it came a clarity he had not expected. He was no longer the hero of his unit, nor the fugitive who had eluded capture. He was simply a man, broken by love and loss, ready to face whatever judgment awaited. The city receded behind him, its lights fading as the car carried him toward an uncertain future, leaving the church and its fleeting sanctuary to the silence of the night. The trial of Jacob Williams gripped Louisiana, a spectacle that drew reporters, curious locals, and television crews to the courthouse steps in New Orleans. The story of a decorated war hero transformed into a murderer captivated the public, its details dissected in newspaper columns and late-night talk shows. The courtroom, with its polished wood and high ceilings, became a stage for a tragedy that unfolded in stark clarity. Jacob sat motionless at the defendant's table, his face gaunt, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the judge's bench. He offered no defense against the charges, admitting his guilt with a calm that unnerved those who expected defiance or despair. He recounted the night of the killings, describing the betrayal he had witnessed, the rage that had consumed him, and the way war had taught him to see enemies in every shadow. His attorney, a weary public defender, attempted to argue that post-traumatic stress had clouded his judgment, but Jacob rejected the narrative. He insisted on being judged as a man, not a victim of circumstance, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. The jury deliberated for only a day before returning a verdict: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, Jacob remained still, his expression unchanged, as if the sentence was merely a formality in a punishment he had already begun to serve. The prison, a sprawling complex of concrete and steel on the outskirts of Baton Rouge, became Jacob's new world. His days settled into a rhythm of monotony: meals in a cavernous mess hall, hours in a cramped cell, brief moments of sunlight in a fenced yard. He kept to himself, avoiding the cliques and conflicts that define life behind bars. Letters arrived sporadically, some from old comrades who had served alongside him in Afghanistan. A few branded him a traitor, their words sharp with betrayal, while others wrote of shared scars, acknowledging the war's lingering toll. Jacob read each one, folding the pages carefully before tucking them into a small box beneath his bunk. Among his few possessions was a photograph of Sarah and Lucas, taken a year before his deployment. It captured them on the porch of the Treme house, Sarah's arm around Lucas's shoulders, both smiling under the shade of the old oak. Jacob would trace their faces with his thumb, trying to summon the warmth of that moment, but the image often blurred into the memory of their final expressions, frozen in shock and pain. He kept the photo hidden, a private relic of a life he could neither reclaim nor forget. Time in prison moved slowly, each day bleeding into the next, marked only by the changing light through the narrow window of his cell. The outside world reached him in fragments: news of hurricanes battering the coast, snippets of music from a guard's radio, the occasional letter from a journalist seeking his story. One visitor broke the routine. Detective Marcus Reed, who arrived months after the trial, his retirement newly begun. Reed, his hair grayer than Jacob remembered, carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was one of Jacob's medals, left behind in the house during the chaos of that night. The detective's visit was brief, his demeanor softened by the absence of his badge. He spoke of mistakes and redemption, suggesting that even heroes could falter, but Jacob offered only a nod in response. The medal remained untouched on the cell's small table, its gleam a reminder of a title that no longer fit. Reed left without looking back, and Jacob never saw him again, though the encounter lingered, a faint ripple in the stillness of his days. New Orleans carried on without Jacob, its rhythm unbroken by the tragedy that had briefly dominated its headlines. The French Quarter pulsed with life, tourists weaving through its streets, their laughter mingling with the wail of saxophones from open-air bars. Mardi Gras came and went, beads and masks littering the sidewalks, while the Mississippi flowed steadily past the city's edge. The house in Treme stood empty, its blue paint fading further under the relentless sun. Weeds crept up the porch, and the swings creaked in the wind, abandoned by the family that had once filled the space with life. Neighbors spoke of the Williams family in hushed tones, their story woven into the city's tapestry of triumphs and sorrows. Some recalled Jacob's quiet pride, Sarah's warm smile, Lucas's resilience despite his wheelchair. Others shook their heads, unable to reconcile the hero with the killer. Over time, the tale grew softer, less distinct. A legend whispered over drinks or recounted to newcomers, one of many shadows cast by a city that held its past close. Jacob's cell offered little comfort, its gray walls unyielding, its air heavy with the scent of disinfectant and rust. Yet he found a strange solace in the routine, the predictability of each hour, a contrast to the chaos that had led him here. He spent hours gazing through the window, a small rectangle that framed a sliver of sky. Sometimes it was blue, streaked with clouds. Other times it glowed orange with the setting sun. He watched it change season after season and thought of the life he had lost. The guilt remained a constant companion, but it had softened into something he could carry. He no longer dreamed of Sarah and Lucas as they had been in life. Instead, his sleep was filled with fragments of war. Dusty roads, the crack of gunfire, faces he could not save. When he woke, he would sit in the dark, his hands clasped, and wonder if his true punishment was not the prison, but the memories that refused to fade. The sky beyond the window offered no answers, but it was enough to remind him that the world continued, even if he could no longer be part of it.